Hello there, my friends, and welcome back to our series, where we discuss, review, and do synopses of various Warhammer books. I am the Grimdark narrator, and today I wanted to discuss with you a novel that is actually quite close to my heart. A book that, for once, isn't part of a 59-volume series, or the culmination of some other set of stories in an Avengers-esque epic conclusion. Although it does feature a number of well-known characters of the setting, and it is just the first part of a duology of volumes. Although you can obviously see it in the title, the book I'm talking about is of course Sword of Justice, written by Chris Wright. And today I'm gonna go over on why I like this book so much, what it's about, and a short summary of the actual story at the end. Also, a bit of extra good news, this week you're gonna be getting 2 videos instead of 1. But before we get into all that, I would like to kindly request that if you enjoy these videos, would like to support me in some kind of manner and miss my old YouTube content, especially my narrations and storytelling, including stuff on this book of today even, please consider checking out my Patreon page. Most of my old content is there now, and quite soon I'm gonna begin to post some really great quality stuff that I've never shared before. Also, because people keep mentioning it in some comments, my old lore videos can also be found on my Rumble page now. The links for both of these are in the video description here. Thank you, and now back to book talk. So, Sword of Justice is actually part of a small sub-series in Warhammer fantasy literature called Warhammer Heroes, although 3 of the books in this series were later re-released in an anthology called Empire Heroes. And I think the original name is a bit funny because out of the 6 volumes in this that I know of, 3 of them are actually focused on villains, namely Wulfric, Sigvald, and a vampire character called the Red Duke. The Red Duke is also a book I wanted to narrate for quite a long time, but alas, the stars never aligned. But returning to the Sword of Justice, as I said earlier, this is only the first half of this epic story, which obviously culminates in the second book, Sword of Vengeance. But we're just gonna talk about the first book today. Now, why is this book so good and special to me? Because at the time when I read it, even though I was accustomed with the Warhammer world, it still felt incredibly immersive. The locations were so detailed and felt so lived in that it sucks you right in. In fact, I think I read this in like 2 or 3 days at a time, which is fairly fast. The plot also, it draws you in, it has a lot of stuff going for it. Interesting and larger-than-life protagonists, check. Well, one major protagonist in this one, namely the gruff, strong, and very loyal Ludwig Schwarzhelm, who also has the legendary position of Emperor's Champion. The plot also features a lot of cloak and dagger stuff, espionage even, and something that you don't often see in Warhammer fantasy novels, or Warhammer overall. And that is subtle chaos cults, and investigations, slow and immersive investigations into said chaos cults. There's also a fair amount of politicking, as the main story deals with a succession crisis in one of the richest provinces and cities of the Empire, namely Averland and the city of Averheim. All of these elements, and more, do combine in a book that does feel both grounded and a bit more mature, for lack of a better term, than some other more straightforward Warhammer books. And I'm not saying that to belittle others, I love Warhammer, but I think we can all agree that some of the books are more simplistic than others. I mean, I love Gotrek and Felix to death, and I'd recommend it to anyone who loves fantasy and adventure, but most of those books are quite straightforward. Sword of Justice, on the other hand, is not only a fair bit longer than some of those, but also the plot has multiple layers, with multiple characters doing things that converge in the end. There's also a layer of whodunit, so atop all the great elements, there's also a bit of Agatha Christie-style investigation. But enough generalization for now. What is Sword of Justice actually about? Without spoiling too much, because we're gonna get to that too in the synopsis, the story revolves around the main protagonist Ludwig Schwarzhelm, a veteran and mighty commander and warrior who holds the prestigious position of Emperor's Champion. What that means is that he's usually sent to be a display of the Emperor's power and authority, while also commanding actual, regiments and armies and such. Now, Schwarzhelm is a pretty likable protagonist, or at least he is to me, because he is a gruff, no-nonsense kind of guy. He has very little charm whatsoever, and we're gonna get into why that is in a minute, but he is the guy who gets the job done. And this man is sent by the Emperor, Karl Franz, to arbitrate a succession issue in the city of Averheim. You see, those folks there were just in a deadlock about who should succeed the Elector Prince who had died, or Elector Count rather. And there are two main candidates, and Schwarzhelm is meant to investigate what's happening and why there is no progress, and eventually pick one. Aiding Schwarzhelm is one of his main agents, and one could say even friend, a spy called Peter Verstolen. And these two, and a few other characters in the Schwarzhelm's entourage, do go to Averheim, where a lot of cloak and dagger stuff happens, and things go from bad to worse because it is a Warhammer book, because of unknown malefactors, and eventually Schwarzhelm has to leave and get even more help. I mentioned earlier that the protagonist is a gruff and kinda charmless guy. And while that is in line with actual lore, it does serve some story purposes really well too. Because just as there are two books in this series, we also kinda have two protagonists, with the second one being, in more ways than one, the competition to Schwarzhelm. This other larger-than-life character is none other than Kurt Helborg, the Reichsmarshal of the Empire and the commander of the Reichsguard. This guy, while also being a great warrior in general, is quite unlike Schwarzhelm. And he is, charismatic and charming, and he loves getting glory in the name of the Emperor. But he's not like a bum or some fop. He too is a great warrior. And these two kinda don't like one another, but they also acknowledge that they're both skilled and they fight for the same ideals and master. I'm only getting into this now because Schwarzhelm is the focus in Sword of Justice, while Kurt Helborg is a bit more of a focus in Sword of Vengeance, but they're both the protagonists. And fun fact, the titles of these books are not just for show either. Both of these great champions of the Empire wield some of the most famous blades in the Warhammer world, two of a set called the Rune Fangs. Not to get too deep into the lore, but the Rune Fangs are ancestral blades made in the time of Sigmar by a legendary dwarf runesmith. And it is only the Elector Counts of the Empire that get one each, as kind of a badge of office. But our two characters are, so good and so essential to the running of the Empire that they too get a Rune Fang. Not plot related, but again, underlining the competition between the two, Schwarzhelm has the most epic beard in the Empire, while Helborg has the most epic mustache. Moving on to some of the themes in this book, since I'm gonna go over the plot in a few minutes, I would say that one of the main themes is definitely the burden of loyalty and position. Schwarzhelm has one of the most prestigious and praised ranks of the Empire, and a lot of people either envy or admire him. But they also often envy and admire the position itself, without bothering to actually look at the man underneath. Ludwig is not a guy who basks in the glory of his own deeds. In fact, he is quite a humble guy, a guy with a lowly soldier's heart. He despises finery and glory seekers and foppery, and all the dilly-dallying he often sees among aristocrats, or even other military officials. He is the definition of a soldier's soldier, who just happens to have a lofty position. So, throughout the story, it is plain to see that Schwarzhelm sometimes struggles with his rank and title. He doesn't actually enjoy some aspects of his job, but he is also one of the most stoic characters you'll ever see, and obviously he never complains and just does his job. While not exactly a theme per se, I would also say that these two characters, Ludwig and Helborg, are also avatars of masculinity in this storytelling. Even though they have their differences, they are both very, very manly men, akin to old Conan stories even, but maybe a bit more sophisticated. Nowadays, we often see terms like toxic masculinity and the emasculation of men in various forms of media. And I'm not one to get into that kind of stuff, but the protagonists of this duology are men at their manliest, and for the most part in the positive sense. Especially for those of us or you who enjoy dark fantasy stories focused on those kinds of characters. And I do mean that in the most praising manner I can think of, because a guy like Schwarzhelm is tough, gruff, and sometimes grouchy, but he's never an asshole. He doesn't look down on other people because of his position. He definitely respects his soldiers, as long as they are, at least halfway competent, and does give everyone a fair shake, as they say. He's the kind of guy who would never ask something of another that he wouldn't do himself. Although he is also a bit inflexible, which will hurt him a bit in the later parts of the story. The novel does show that the Empire's greatest threat isn't just the monsters outside the walls. It's very often, human ambition, bureaucracy, and internal corruption. I mentioned earlier that one of the most positive aspects of the book is how it draws you in and engrosses you in its world. And I couldn't move on without praising that aspect at least one more time. The cities, in particular, in this case Altdorf and Averheim as a focus, are incredibly detailed and feel lived in. You get as close as you can, with a book at least, to seeing the streets and neighborhoods and districts, especially of Averheim, where a lot of the action takes place, as all the investigations and the political shenanigans there actually move across many locations in the city. So, with all that said, would I recommend Sword of Justice by Chris Wright? The answer is hell yes. With the caveat that this is only half the story, and you are going to definitely want to read Sword of Vengeance afterwards. But worry not, you are definitely gonna be motivated to do it. In fact, I do remember all those years ago when I first read this one, and that quite shocking cliffhanger ending, and I was like, I must know what happens next. And I don't remember if Sword of Vengeance wasn't out yet at the time, or I just couldn't get it. But I do remember being very excited when I finally did get it, and I got to read it at last. Usually when I watch something or play or read or whatever, and it ends in a cliffhanger, at least nowadays, I'm usually like, okay, I'll see it eventually, maybe if it gets made, or maybe not. But this was one of the rare occasions when I was actually invested enough to actively care and want to see more. Now, for the last part of the video, let's do a bit of a synopsis for this individual book. Keep in mind that there will be spoilers, and even though I don't want to go into every single nook and cranny, because I do want to leave the viewer with some of the mysteries to discover for themselves. So once upon a time, our story opens with a great battle in the northern forests of the Empire. Empire soldiers are trapped by a massive beastman horde led by a powerful shaman called Ragram. It is here that Ludwig Schwarzhelm arrives with reinforcements and personally cuts down some of the monsters, killing both the shaman and the Doom Bull in single combat. A Doom Bull is basically a very strong minotaur. But despite the victory, Schwarzhelm is bitter, as Reichsmarshal Kurt Helborg was supposed to support his advance but arrived late, forcing Schwarzhelm's force to take some casualties. When they both return to Altdorf, they are celebrated in a grand parade. Schwarzhelm, as mentioned earlier, despises the political theater, but Helborg basks in the glory, and he sharpens the tension between the so-called two swords of the Emperor, him and Schwarzhelm. Afterwards, Emperor Karl Franz summons Schwarzhelm for a crucial assignment. You see, Everland, the province, is on the verge of collapse. Ever since their eccentric Elector Count Marius Leitdorf was slain years ago by orcs, no successor had been crowned, and the succession crisis was reaching a climax. There were two main candidates vying for power here: Rufus Leitdorf, the son of the dead count, who is backed by the traditionalists who remember his father, with the rather unfortunate caveat of madness running in that family. The other candidate is a popular figure backed by rich merchants called Heinz Mark Grosslich, or Grosslich. The emperor sends Schwarzhelm to Averheim as an imperial arbiter to restore order and oversee the selection of a new elector count, or outright pick one if they can't get their feet moving. Schwarzhelm brings spymaster Peter Verstolen to accompany him and another captain of his troops called Bloch, or Bloch. To demonstrate Schwarzhelm's unyielding character, there is also an intermediary episode where Schwarzhelm condemns a noble to death because they were doing some cultist activity. When they arrive in Averheim, Schwarzhelm finds the provincial capital in turmoil. There are street thugs hired by both parties to riot in the streets, and a corrupting drug called Weird Root is rampant among the population. Local authorities either don't want to or can't prevent all these problems. But Schwarzhelm, being a man of action, does things immediately. He hangs corrupt guards, he enforces curfews, and uses his own troops to suppress the street violence. At the same time, Schwarzhelm begins suffering from some unnatural exhaustion, headaches, nightmares, and that kind of stuff, which, unbeknownst to anyone at that point, is pushed by the dark cult operating in the city. While investigating, Verstolen discovers that the corruption isn't just common greed, it is in fact a cult of Slaanesh that infiltrated the aristocratic court. And here, I would like to again praise the author for writing a chaos cult that is both sinister and sneaky, without being over the top, at least not in the beginning anyway. There is actual tension and dread while this investigation goes deeper and deeper. While political intrigue peaks inside Averheim, unfortunately there is also an orc army that sweeps down from the mountains to invade the province. Schwarzhelm, ever the soldier, has to balance his duties here with actually fighting off the orcs, and he takes his own small army and the troops from Averheim and Averland itself to defend the province, while the two candidates were still at each other's throats. He marches out with the local regiments and Captain Bloch, but in the meantime, Kurt Helborg arrives with the Reichsguard to deliver a crushing blow to the Greenskins, once again stealing the military spotlight. During all this chaos, the Slaaneshi cult's trap is sprung. The cult of Slaanesh manipulates the succession council, and Heinz-Mark Grosslich secures the vote, becoming the new elector count. Schwarzhelm realizes too late that the entire election had been rigged through some mind-altering drugs, political machinations, and corrupt advisors. And these include the secret betrayals stretching back all the way to Altdorf, including a person who was an old friend of Schwarzhelm. But I'm not gonna spoil more than that. Grosslich, now officially installed as the elector count, is himself a puppet of the cult. When Schwarzhelm confronts the newly appointed count, he's framed for treason and actually gets to fight and duel Helborg himself. Unfortunately, this obviously harms his reputation, and even though he was being hurt and manipulated and slowly corrupted by the power of the Chaos Cult itself. Also, maybe not funny, but at this point Schwarzhelm does defeat Helborg in a duel. Maybe it was the fact that Helborg held back, or maybe it was the stress that got to Schwarzhelm because of the attempted chaos corruption, but it is interesting to see which one of them would win in a combat situation. Now, defeated politically and isolated from his allies, Schwarzhelm realizes that he was played with by forces deep within the imperial court. And the book does end on a bit of a cliffhanger, setting directly into Sword of Vengeance. Grosslich, a puppet of the cult, holds Averland, Chaos is behind him, and Schwarzhelm has to become rogue for a little while in order to clean up the corruption outside the bounds of the law. And that is how it ends. With that said, this has been my review and impression of Sword of Justice by Chris Wright. In my humble opinion, actually not just one of the best Warhammer fantasy novels around, but also a solid dark fantasy story in its own right, even if you know nothing about Warhammer. If you enjoyed this, do consider leaving a like, share, subscribe, and click the bell icon for notifications. Also, do share your thoughts in the comments. Are you a fan of this set of books? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Let us know why below. Thanks a lot for watching or listening to the end, and I will hopefully see you relatively soon for Sword of Vengeance, why not? Sigmar's blessings be upon you.